Hey guys, Vik and Chaitanya here with our honors physics presentation. Today we will be discussing the physics of flight. Join us as we take off.
Have you ever wondered how a bird can fly? Looking at this diagram of a bird, notice the features that may help it fly, such as hollow bones, wings, feathers, heavy body weight, a streamlined body, and a distinctive lack of teeth.
Take a moment to consider this question for yourself. You'll have your answer by the end of the video. Which of these three things makes it possible for a bird to fly? Is it A, teeth, a heavier body weight, the thrust it gets from the object? B, no teeth, feathers, a heavier body weight? C, hollow bones, streamlined body and teeth? Or D, hollow bones, no teeth, and airfoil-shaped wings?
No doubt Orville and Wilbur Wright had the same question as they sought to create their very first flying machine. Born and raised in Ohio, the Wright brothers spent most of their time in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. It was here that, with generous wind and open landscape, the inventors would employ history's first successful airplane. After 6 years of numerous trials and redesigns, the brothers had achieved flight.
After perfecting the design of their glider, the Wright brothers added their own power source, an engine. Notice that with each new design, as depicted here, the Wright brothers improved the length, quality, and shape of the wings. They also increased the complexity of the tail and added motorized propellers. These improvements were supported by their data from lift and drag equations, as well as countless tests from their wind tunnel.
But how did these changes improve flight? Well, it starts with airfoils. What is an airfoil, you ask? Well, airfoils are objects capable of harnessing the surrounding air to produce lift. Lift is the upwards force that causes aircrafts to rise. An airplane's wings, tail surface, and propellers all act as airfoils to lift the aircraft. Airfoil dynamics are derived from a combination of the continuity equation, Bernoulli's principle, and the relationship between force, pressure, and area. The continuity equation states that for a fluid acting within a system where mass is conserved, an increase in area corresponds to a decrease in fluid velocity, and a decrease in area corresponds to an increase in fluid velocity. Bernoulli's principle states that an increase in fluid speed corresponds to a decrease in pressure, and a decrease in a fluid speed corresponds to an increase in its pressure. Now let's talk about the relationship between force, pressure, and area. So if pressure is equal to force divided by area, and force is equal to pressure times area.
Well, how does this apply to an airfoil? First, we may define an airfoil in air as an isolated system where mass is conserved. The mass of the airfoil does not change, nor does the volume flow of air as it moves over the airfoil change. Thus, mass is conserved. Then, applying the continuity equation, more area below the airfoil relative to above means that the velocity of air flowing beneath must be lower than that above. Now, applying Bernoulli's principle, air is moving slower beneath the airfoil, creating a higher pressure environment relative to above where airspeed is higher. Finally, according to the relationship between force, pressure, and area, a greater pressure corresponds to a larger overall force. Thus, the force pushing up from the wing's underside is greater than that pushing down. The difference in these forces generates lift.
These equations apply to air because air is a fluid. A fluid has no fixed shape because its molecules move relatively freely. Now, air is a fluid because its molecules can also move freely and constantly. Windy environments such as Kitty Hawk favor flight.
The importance of moving air, as in wind, can be derived from the laws of motion. According to Newton's first law, the law of inertia, a system at rest will remain at rest unless an external force acts upon it. Similarly, a stationary airplane will remain stationary until acted upon by the external force of wind. According to Newton's second law of motion, force equals mass times acceleration. During a windy day, air has a greater acceleration. Therefore, the wind will apply a greater force to the airplane's foil. As pressure is equal to force divided by area, a larger force from the wind implies a greater pressure, which in turn creates a higher force beneath the airfoil to cause lift. Newton's third law, that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, can also be applied to aerodynamics. Just as the pressure from the wind's airfoil causes lift on the airfoil itself deflects the flow of the air acting on it downward. Naturally, an airplane must abide by all three laws of motion.
We have already partly discussed the major force of lift. It is a force produced by an object's movement through a fluid to cause it rise vertically. However, there are three other major forces of flight that must be taken into account. That is drag, weight, and thrust. Drag is the friction force of an object as it moves through a fluid. Weight is the force from the Earth's center of mass acting on an object to pull it downward, and it is dependent on the mass of the object. Thrust is the force that propels an object forward into motion horizontally. In the case of an airplane, the thrust is caused by the engines burning fuel. Note that thrust and drag are opposing forces, while the same is true for lift and weight. The relative relationship between these four forces is critical to aerodynamics and determines an aircraft's motion.
However, most important is that relationship between lift and drag. The ratio of the two determines an airplane's aerodynamic efficiency, and the higher the ratio of the lift to drag, the greater the airplane's efficiency. This relationship becomes clear when we begin to compare the equations for both lift and drag. Notice that in both equations, we must account for the volume squared, the radius of the size, the area, and the coefficients of either lift or drag, depending on the equation. Now, when we put these into a ratio, notice that all variables, aside from the coefficient of drag and the coefficient of lift, cancel out. Therefore, the efficiency of a material is determined by the coefficient of drag versus the coefficient of lift.
But how do you control an airplane? Notice the wings and ailerons, which are the flaps on the wings. When the wings are at different height levels, it will cause the airplane to roll and horizontally change direction. Now, some aircrafts have noses in the front, in which raising the nose causes the airplane to ascend because it generates more lift. However, when an airplane takes off, raising the nose also increases the drag, which makes it burn fuel faster. Likewise, lowering the nose causes the airplane to descend. Now, the rudder acts as an airfoil, which affects the total lift of an aircraft. Moving the rudder left causes the airplane to move left, and moving the rudder right causes the airplane to move right. However, the rudder and ailerons must work together in order to make a turn. Now notice the elevators on the plane's tail. The pilot uses a wheel to raise and lower the elevators. Raising the elevator causes the nose to go up and ascends the plane, while lowering the elevator causes the nose to go down and descend the airplane. It is imperative that the nose and elevators work concurrently and together to change the vertical direction of an airplane.
Okay, let's recap. Airfoils cause a low velocity and thus a high pressure underneath the airfoil, which produces upward lift. Meanwhile, air travels at a high velocity above the airfoil, which creates a low pressure environment. Lift is the upward force on an airplane. Drag resists motion and is equivalent to the friction force of air. Weight is the downward force of the airplane, and thrust is the horizontal force accelerating the airplane forward. The relationship between these four forces determines an airplane's movement. However, lift and drag especially determine an airplane's efficiency.
Now, let's ask the question that we asked at the beginning of the presentation. Which of these three things makes it possible for a bird to fly? Hopefully, by now, you've correctly answered that it's D, hollow bones, no teeth, and an airfoil-shaped wing.
But why? Well, let's look at it. No teeth helps reduce the overall weight of the bird. Hollow bones does the same. And airfoiled wings allow for optimal lift. Now, here's an interesting fact. Feathers also act as an airfoil. They are lightweight and provide a solid surface to push against the air.
Thank you for your time, and we hope you learned a lot about airplanes.